I will tell you this. Here's what we know in sports psych. What we know is that our thoughts affect our emotions, which affect our physiological response, which ultimately dictates our performance, right? Drew, you know this. This is how we start every mental performance training session. Our freshmen already can say it out, off the top of their head. Our thoughts affect our emotions, which affect our physiological response, which dictates our performance. And the reality of it is that we can control our thoughts. Now, again, we can't always control which thoughts try to come into our head, but we can choose what we do with those thoughts once we get them.
Dr. Selking, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Yeah, absolutely, Drew. Great to see you again and excited to spend some time chatting today.
I was doing a little bit of research on you and I found this TED Talk and I wanted to play this poem you started out for our listeners.
If you think you're beaten, you are. If you think you dare not, you don't. If you'd like to win but think you can't, it's almost certain you won't. If you think you've lost, you'll lose. For out in this world we find success begins with a person's will. It's all in a state of mind. Life's battles might not always go to the stronger or faster one, but sooner or later the one who wins is the one who thinks she can. Now my mom actually made...
So your mom made you memorize that. But maybe for our listeners, why is that poem by Walter Wintle so important to you? And maybe give us a little background on yourself and how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah, so that poem by Walter Wintle is called "Thinking," and I remember my mom made me memorize it when I was young. I grew up in a small town in northeastern Pennsylvania. I was a soccer player. My family had McDonald's franchises, so we were in the business world. I lived out in the country, so I raised livestock. School was really important to me. My faith was really important to me. So those were sort of the worlds that I dabbled in growing up, and she made me memorize that, and it was part of a talk I gave in 4-H. And little did I know back then what a critical concept that would be that would underlie basically everything that I do in life. And so that was really, if you think you're beaten, you are. If you think you dare not, you don't. If you'd like to win but think you won't, it's almost certain that you won't. And so, it all begins in your mind. And, again, I thought that was something that was one of those little motivational quotes or poems that hang on your refrigerator, your mom makes you memorize, and a good little motivational boost for a moment. But what I came to find, as my life unfolded, left that small town, had the chance to play soccer at the University of Notre Dame before injury took my career. And then, went and worked in corporate America for a couple years and then found the field of sports psychology. And what I found in the field of sports psychology was the fact that it really all begins in your mind and that your thinking really does matter, and that thoughts are, not just these ephemeral things that float around in your head or nice words that are on your refrigerator, but that thoughts can actually rewire your brain and how you show up on a moment by moment, day by day basis. And so from that, that thinking poem again sort of undergirds a lot of the work that I do from a sport and performance psychology standpoint and at the neurological level, what we know about brain science. So pretty cool thing that when you're 9 years old, that comes back to be a part of your professional life for sure.
Well, I obviously know you from my playing days at Notre Dame, but I wanted to do a little more research on you. And I found this TED Talk and I thought it was fascinating because you mentioned in there the question that literally sent you to grad school was, what is it that makes humans perform their best consistently when it matters most? And it's something, obviously, as a professional athlete, I'm very, very interested in. Since getting your PhD in sports psychology, and I guess working in many different facets with many different people and many different performers, have you found any answers to that question?
Yeah, I think that, again, how do we deliver our best? That's one part of the equation, right? When it matters most or consistently, right? So how do we deliver our best and then consistently and then when it matters most, right? So those are almost three separate pieces that as high performers, we're looking to how do we put those three things together, right? So that we can perform our best consistently, particularly when it matters most, when the pressure's on, when maybe we don't feel like it, when the stakes are really high. And, quite frankly, what I believe is that high performance is really grounded upon a solid sense of self-identity. Like that's really where it starts. My personal theory of performance excellence is that it all starts with identity. And when we really know who we are as the man or the woman under the jersey, it allows us to strip away a lot of the volatility that exists in the performance world, in the world of life, right? Like if you've been alive long enough, you know that you're going to have highs and you're going to have lows. And there's an emotionality that exists there. But I think when your identity is firmly grounded and rooted in something beyond just the wins and losses that come with life, then you're able to navigate that a lot more consistently. So that's really where my theory of performance excellence begins, is this identity piece. And then I think we layer on top of identity mindsets, right? Mindsets are patterned ways of thinking about ourselves, about the world around us, about situations, what it means to be down by 6 points with, a minute 40 left on the clock. What's your mindset about that? And that will determine how you show up to those moments. And then the next layer of my theory is that then it comes down to leadership, right? Leadership of yourself, leadership of the system or the structure that you're a part of. And I think when you can get those three things aligned as a high performer, it increases your probability of delivering your best consistently when it matters most.
I love that identity piece. And I want to explore that a little bit. When you're talking about the identity piece, is it kind of this detachment from your professional self? Like, is it, I've got football Drew, or I've got, podcast host Drew, but then I have like me as the person, my relationships, my faith, all the things that make me who I am. When you talk about that identity piece, is it finding ground in those things so that no matter the ebbs and flows of your vocation, of your performance, it allows you to stay steady in that?
Yeah. So, identity, man, you could spend a whole graduate career studying the concept of identity, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, identity is not what you do, it's who you are, right? It's that thread of Drew Tranquil that has existed within you throughout the course of your entire life, right? From the time you were a little guy all the way to today. And then what we do is a part of our identity, absolutely, right? But I think a lot of times people really allow what they do to become who they are, or they think that it is, right? So again, if you win a football game, then that means you're a winner. If you lose a football game, that means you're a loser. If you're out of the game altogether and you retire or you get injured, then you're really a loser, And I think that is the big element of the identity piece that we talk about. But it's also interesting, when you think about the fact that you play these different roles, how can elite performers can we best think of that? And they've actually done an interesting study that looks at mental toughness as it relates to sort of self-concept. And one of the things that they found was that individuals who had a positive and integrated sense of self across all the different roles that they played had higher levels of mental toughness than those that had a compartmentalized and or negative self-perception of those different roles. So let me break that down just a little bit. One, like if you think about, what you just mentioned is, Drew as an individual, Drew as a husband, Drew as a father, Drew as a podcaster, Drew as a professional athlete, those are different roles that you play. And if you have a positive, you see yourself in a good light as a husband, or as a man, as a husband, as a father, as an athlete, as a professional, and integrated, right? So you are a similar Drew to those different roles that you show up as, then you're going to have higher levels of mental toughness than an individual who, hey, I'm Drew this when I'm by myself. I'm this Drew when I'm with my wife. I'm this Drew when I'm with my kids. I'm this Drew when I'm in a professional sport context. Like that gets very exhausting for individuals to try to maintain all of those different identities, right? Versus understanding that there's a core of who you are as a human being that if you can allow to thread through each of those roles, then they can sort of it's like wearing a different outfit, if you're going to the beach, you're going to wear something different than if you're going mountain climbing, than if you're going to play football, than if you're going to a business presentation, right? And so, but there's still the same core of the man under all of those outfits, right, that show up to those different areas. But again, it's important to have different outfits for those different roles, or you wouldn't be equipped to deliver your best in those moments. And so I think that's a way for us to think about this thread of a consistent identity along with all the roles that we play as people in the world.
When you're talking with your clients, whether it's the Notre Dame football team or executives in the business world, is this positive self-image across all buckets of one's life, is that something that's learned and can be taught? Or is that we each have a certain level of that? It seems like in the locker room, like you can tell first day of training camp, like guys will come on the field and you're like, that dude just oozes of like this confidence that he has in himself and his ability to get the job done. And then there's some guys that come out and they might be a little bit skeptical, whether that's just a lack of confidence or maybe it's an injury that happened last year. I'm interested, maybe, is that something that you've learned as a sports psychologist that can be taught and like your level of positive self-image can be grown? Or is it something that we're just kind of born with and built into our genetic gene pool and we have a certain ceiling as to how we see ourselves?
That's such a good question. I think so many people wrestle with that. And I am a firm believer that we can absolutely grow in our self identity and our confidence. But I think a lot of people believe that, what is my purpose in life or what is my identity? They seem like such big questions that I think a lot of people avoid even interacting with those questions. And so they avoid or they suppress, or they don't know how to articulate or ask the right questions, or they've never been asked questions. That really relate to fleshing out their identity. But I think that's why you have mental performance coaches, psychologists. So I'm not a licensed sports psychologist. So I don't deal with the clinical side of sports psychology, but I am a applied sports psychology practitioner, right? Which is more on the performance side. I use the analogy of like as athletes, right? You either go to the training room or you go to the weight room. Oftentimes you're going to both, right? To rehab things that are hurt or broken or sore, and then to train things to get bigger, faster, stronger. In the field of mental performance, like it's more like going to the weight room, right? There's occasionally things that we can talk about that would be like prehab, right? But that's sort of the difference between clinical and applied sports psychology. And that's, I think, the benefits of working with individuals like that is you can help people explore some of those questions that seem really big, but quite frankly, if you start to seek, you find answers to and are able to flesh out. And so I absolutely believe that you can grow in your self-confidence, that you can grow in your identity. And what we find too is some guys might be really confident when they step on the football field, but when they go home to be in an intimate relationship with a significant other, or try to be a parent, they don't have a good self-conception or perception of who they are in those different roles. So it's also about helping people really think through and identify who they are, how they've been wired, right? So this is where we use a lot of different profiles and assessments to help people understand their natural wiring, and then how to really cultivate that natural wiring and strengths into showing up as the man or woman that you want to be in those different roles and moments that you have.
Fascinating. Another thing I found really interesting, kind of along the lines of what we're talking about right now, is you said in your TED Talk, and it's I think, controversial, and I think you even mentioned that in your TED Talk, but one of the research and quotes you pulled from, you said, brain science reveals 75 to 98% of all mental and physical health issues are a result of our thought life, which means only 2 to 25% are a result of genes or our environment. You gave this TED Talk a few years ago. I'm interested, one, like what specific research and studies you might have pulled this from that maybe our listeners could go check out themselves, because I think this is fascinating, because I think mental illness and mental health in general is a roaring issue and topic in America today, specifically in the sports world, but even in the business world. So maybe where you got those resources, and then is this something you still are grounded in, or maybe your years of experience in the field has changed this perception? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that research comes from Dr. Caroline Leaf, who's a practitioner, a clinical counseling psychologist. Now she does more of the speaking world, but she was actually on the forefront of research that is known as neuroplasticity. And so originally they thought that the brain was static and unchanging, right? You got to an adult form and your brain was what it was. But she really believed that we could be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And so that's really what set her on this quest to understand, well, can the brain actually grow and change based on what we think about? And again, she was on that forefront of the research back in the 70s that said, whoa, actually the brain is what we call neuroplastic, aka that it can grow and change based on what we think about. And so that's really the research that underlines this concept of mental health. A lot of mental health issues stems from our thought life, right? Because our thoughts build mindsets, and those mindsets rewire how the brain is functioning. And we can literally wire in health or wire in sickness into our mind in different ways. And so, I'm a firm believer in neuroplasticity. I'm a firm believer that, as we think in our hearts, so that we are, so that literally impacts how we show up. And so, yeah, that is still something that I believe. I think this whole conversation around mental health in our society today, I think a lot of times when we say mental health, what we're actually talking about is mental sickness. And we've put the word health on it as if we're talking about health, and we're not. We're often talking about sickness. I think that if we focus on things that we know in the field of sports psychology and positive psychology, we can actually help build mental health from the beginning instead of trying to fix everything that's broken after people spend their whole lives thinking incorrectly and not learning how to manage their thoughts and their minds and their hearts through the world. So, I'm a big that's why, in Notre Dame football, that's why we have the foundational mental performance training program, because it's intended to help people understand, hey, this is how your brain works. This is how it impacts how you show up. And here's some tools and strategies that you can use to manage your mind and emotions to help you show up more consistently as the best version of yourself. And I think if we can do that more consistently across the board, I mean, shoot, I think teaching positive psychology to kindergartners, because if we can, because it's brain science, and the cool thing is we all have a brain, and obviously, it looks a little bit different when I'm working with little kids, because we draw more pictures and giggle more and all those fun things, versus when I'm working with pros like you, and we really put in the scientific concept. But I guess that's my thoughts in general on the concept of neuroplasticity and how important our thought life is, what that can do to our physical and our mental health. And then, finally, what the mental health conversation in our society today, again, I think is too slanted towards unhealth and treating anxiety, depression, all of those elements with things like drugs versus, how do we get on the forefront of this and find some of the or on the front end of this and find some of the root causes and actually help people wire in health from the beginning.
I think Dr. Caroline Leaf is awesome. I've listened and read a little bit of her work, and I think I've heard a few neurologists speak on the topic of plasticity. And I think it's a really, really cool concept, specifically in regards to performance and how we can build and shape our minds. And I'm interested because we have listeners ranging from, high school students, college students, to athletes, to business professionals, to husbands, to wives. So we've got a range of audience. I'm interested maybe to dive a little bit more into this concept of plasticity, because it would seem that if I've had a negative mindset or a negative way of thinking, or I've allowed failures or setbacks, or maybe I've had an injury or a death in the family or a bad experience at work, that over time has kind of shaped the way I've thought. And with this concept of plasticity has then resulted in my brain functioning or developing in a certain way. I'm interested maybe if Caroline Leaf has talked about this, or if you know anything about this. If I've had a negative way of thinking, does it require an equal amount of time to reshape and redevelop my brain to where I can have this positive self-image that we've even been talking about for the last few minutes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So she would say, and I don't have the research to support this, but she would say that it is the brain actually wires in things like health and positivity and joy and hope and optimism easier than it wires in fear, insecurity, negativity, anxiety, etc., because that's how the brain was created in its original intent by the creator, right? And so that would be her stance on it. I will tell you this. Here's what we know in sports psych. What we know is that our thoughts affect our emotions. which affect our physiological response, which ultimately dictates our performance, right? Drew, you know this. This is how we start every mental performance training session. Our freshmen already can say it out, off the top of their head. Our thoughts affect our emotions, which affect our physiological response, which dictates our performance. And the reality of it is that we can control our thoughts. Now, again, we can't always control which thoughts try to come into our head, but we can choose what we do with those thoughts once we get them. And so I would encourage everybody to have a fun little exercise of before you walk into your house in the evening or walk into your team at work or whatever it is that you're doing, start thinking about something that makes you really upset, either really anxious or really mad or really upset in some way, and then see how you start to feel about it. See what your feelings start to elicit, and then try to check what's happening physiologically. Do you feel your heart rate going up? Is your body temperature increasing? Do you feel your muscle tightening up? And then go be with the people that you need to be around and see how that goes for you. And then on the other side of that, try sitting in your car, but when you come home after work and starting to think about all the things that you're grateful for and how much you love the people that are on the other side of that door, even if you had a really long, difficult day, and spend some time thinking about those things and start to recognize, how does that make you feel? And then physiologically, what starts to happen to you? And then gauge how that impacts how you show up when you walk through that door. And I think that that's a really good way for us to just see the power of our thoughts in general. Now that's the power of thought, right? Now, what I've said is that mindsets are patterned ways of thinking, protein patterns that get wired into your brain. How does that happen? That happens by repeating certain thoughts over and over and over again. So I like to think of thoughts of like bicep curls for your brain, right? The more bicep curls you do, what happens, Drew?
You get stronger.
You get stronger. What happens when you stop lifting weights?
Atrophy.
The brain operates in the exact same way. It's not a muscle in the scientific sense, but it functions like a muscle in the extent that the parts of it that we use grow and get stronger. The parts of it that we don't use atrophy, right? Or get weaker and start to dissipate. And so to your point of, man, I've spent my whole life wiring in these mindsets of fear and insecurity and loneliness and depressive thoughts and anxious thoughts. What now? Well, now you need to stop exercising, right? Stop repeating those thoughts and start flexing some muscles and building thoughts into your brain that actually wire in who you want to be and how you want to show up to the world around you. And so I believe that you can do that, faster, that you can wire out that old stuff and wire in new stuff if you're intentional and consistent in doing so.
I think this is so cool because I think why it's been such a slow development in this field of sports psych, specifically in its application to the sports world, is you have kind of this out there concept, right? The mind, like what even is the mind? You can't touch the mind. It's this, some people call it this consciousness, this thought life, like you said, but it's really cool that kind of abstract thing can actually have physiological implications for our brain. Our literal brain, the muscle like in our head, and that can actually spill over and affect our performance. And I think it's fascinating, and it even connects to your dissertation a little bit. And I want to pivot a little bit because Drew Brees recently retired from the NFL, and you spent your dissertation studying NFL players' transitions from the NFL into normal life. And I'm interested maybe what some of your findings were with that research and maybe how it applies to what we're talking about now with this shift in mindset and how it could have physical implications on our actual brain and our performance and approach to life.
Yeah. So, I took what they call, this is totally nerding out for a moment, but I took what they call a grounded theory approach to this research. So it was a qualitative study, which means, there weren't numbers and data and correlations that we put together, but through stories, lived experiences of former players. And the grounded theory approach, usually in research, you go in with a particular theory and you analyze a situation through the lens of a theory, right? Or apply it to it. What grounded theory does is says like, man, all I want to know is what's happening, the actual lived experiences of the individuals that are a part of what I'm looking at. And then I actually want to build a theory based on the reality of their lives that helps us better understand that situation so that others can maybe navigate it better. And so what resulted from all of these interviews that I did with former players was a 3 model theory that really looked at the mental and emotional transition experience of men in the NFL and thereafter. What was really neat, we thought maybe we would have to narrow our scope, like, okay, hey, we're just going to interview guys that played 3 to 5 years, right? Or guys that played 10 plus years in the leagues, or like the one and done population to be able to, communicate something of actual substance. But it was interesting because the research told us different. The research said that, you know what? It doesn't matter if a guy played 1 year, if a guy just bounced around the teams and never even really made a full year, full roster, or if he played 10 years in the league, won a Super Bowl, and was in the Pro Bowl multiple times. What mattered is that he tasted and played professional football. And if he did that, this theory applies to it. And so, when I was going into my dissertation committee, I thought to myself, well, you know what? They could fail me on this, but as I walked the guys in the study through the 3 models on the back end, I had multiple guys just crying and saying, I've never seen what I went through or what I'm going through so clearly and like accurately laid out. And it gives me hope that I can really do this thing and make this transition. And so, I think more than anything in my dissertation, that was the most meaningful element of that. Like, man, we were able to capture what the essence of that transition was. And in grounded theory, what you're trying to identify. So I just, I asked guys about their transition experience, right? And then through that, I was trying to identify what is the main problem that these individuals are trying to solve during the transition experience, and then how did they go about solving that? And so the main problem that came out that guys had to solve when their career ended was, how do I rediscover and redefine purpose in my life now that football's over? And so that became the whole quest, right, of the study, is how do I, that rediscovery and redefinition of purpose. And so the 3rd model in the theory is actually a breakdown of, what they went through to help them rediscover and redefine purpose in their life. And it started with, shocker, redefining their self-identity and understanding, again, how are they wired as people? What were coping skills that they've used in the past that worked that, maybe don't work now? And really finding new ways to cope with things. The second part of that was humbling themselves, like understanding that the world does not revolve around them and that there are others in it, and that they can serve those people and have a meaningful life, even if they aren't the center of attention. And then finally, replicating the blueprint of success, understanding that, man, I was less than 1% of the population who got to play professional football. Like, I was really, really good at something in my life. What did I do that got me there? And then how do I replicate that blueprint for success in whatever my heart has discerned as the call for the next season of that? So, that's sort of a high level look at that last model in the theory of that rediscovery of purpose.
So the 3 prongs were kind of rediscovering the self-identity, maybe apart from football, humbling oneself to maybe say, you know what, I'm not in the center of the news. I'm not on the newspaper anymore. I'm not the center of attention. And hey, that's okay. And then re-replicating or duplicating the model that led them to success in the first place. Or am I correct there?
Yep, you got it.
Right on. So I guess in its application, what have you found that, and maybe your work with some athletes, and maybe it's athletes that are still playing and are preparing maybe to transition out. What have you found that works or maybe doesn't work within that model, or have you found that it's kind of worked pretty flawlessly with these guys?
Yeah, what was interesting in the first model, it was really looking at sort of like a macro life timeline from the time a guy is born till, when they started playing football at some point in that life. And then, it got to a point where football ended, right? And then there was always this point where they accepted that football ended. And what was fascinating is that it wasn't really until they got to a point of accepting that football was over that they were really able to, Chuck Noll is a legendary football coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And one of the guys was telling me that back in the day, if a guy got released or retired for whatever reason, Coach Noel would come out and he'd let everybody know that so and so has moved on and they've decided to get on with their life's work. And that's what he would call it. They've decided to get on with their life's work, and he never knew what that meant until 20 years later, when he was looking back on his own life and thinking about his own transition out of there. And so it really isn't until people are really assume this responsibility or acceptance, basically, that football is over, that they're able to really get on with their life's work. Again, interestingly, some guys were aware of that before football even ended, right? They entered sport knowing that it was going to end eventually and already accepting that. So it led them to do things like network, have internships, steward their money wisely, make sure they were mindful of the people that they surrounded themselves with, because they knew it wasn't going to last forever. And again, some of those guys had long careers. Some of them were short-lived. But I think that that's something that, if you've got any players out there that are listening right now, that's maybe one of the best points you can just wrap your head around, is make sure deep down in your heart that it's going to end eventually. And it's still going to be hard, even if you know that, but it will lead you to do the things that come with the understanding of that data point, right? If this is over or could be over tomorrow, what are the things that you would want to have in place, or that you would want to be doing to make sure that you can navigate the transition out easier, and then do those things? Like I said, network, manage your money, get around the right people, think through some of that stuff. And again, it doesn't minimize the pain that goes with it when that's over, because you've committed so much of your life to it, but it will help you, navigate that transition with more intentionality.
It seems like football, it's a nice, I think, neat in some ways example, because I think guys' career, right, is, 3.5 years on average professionally. But it's an intense moment, because a lot of these guys have committed, their lives to training and reaching that point. And there's multiple steps. But maybe expand a little bit, maybe to the executive, the business world, because, people's careers are obviously longer than that of an athlete. But are there similar trends, whether it's they're retiring, or maybe they're changing jobs, or maybe they got let go? Have you found that this model might even apply to the business and executive world as well?
Yeah, so you're not technically supposed to do this in research unless you conduct a formal study that shows that this model actually also applies to these other areas. But what was fascinating is one of the members two members actually on my dissertation committee, one was retiring after 37 years of being, he was Dr. Rick McGuire. He was the head track and field coach at Missouri for 27 years, led the sports psychology program at Mizzou for 37 years, started USA track and field sports psychology program, like a legend in the field of sports psych. And he was actually retiring, or on the brink of retirement, when I was defending my dissertation. And then another member on my committee, Dr. Pat Ivey, at the time was transitioning from a senior role in the athletic department into a vice chancellor role within the academic side. So transition between actual roles. And then another individual that I had read this was going through a divorce at the same time. And so really interesting, like you said, different people going through some pretty serious transitions, that as they were reading it were like, well, I feel like this applies to me right now. And this is where I'm at in, one of these three models, and maybe some things that I can do. So, I do think my husband and Aaron and I were just talking about how much we love and miss sport, right? Because it's so clean. Like you said, when your season is, what the preparation cycle is, at the end of a game, if you've won or lost, right? You get immediate feedback, you can go back to work, and then you can get on with it. And work and business and relationships are so long, right? And there's not these intense periods of highs and lows, if you will, that sort of sustain you from an emotional standpoint. So how do you do that? And I do think this model can help people, that if they're, navigating out of a career, that can help them, again, keep fleshing out their identity and keep that vision of what success means and looks like for your life alive and well. I think some people, they only have one vision of what success looks like. And the reality of it is that life is multidimensional. Like that's what we talked about earlier, right? You've got your relationships, you've got what you do outside of work, you've got your professional life. And so, what does success look like in all of those areas? And then what season of life are you in? If you've spent 30 years in a career, man, success doesn't look the same anymore, but that doesn't mean that it's failure either. And I think that that's something that's really important. Like for me, I've had 6 leg surgeries. Like I can't play sport like I used to. And for a while I really struggled with that of like, well, if I can't work out for an hour and a half, it's not even a real workout, And I'd go for like a jog and I'd be like, that's not a workout. So why even do it? And then I spent like about 3 years, I just didn't do anything, And I think I had to redefine what success looked like for me, living a healthy lifestyle and taking care of my body outside of what it used to look like as an elite athlete. Right. And so I think the same is true with our professional careers.
I'm obviously coming off season ending injury. And so I think even for me, a critical step this off season is developing this kind of robust mindset of like, I'm going to be okay. In fact, I'm going to come back stronger. The cliche, right? I'm interested, like football for me, there's like obvious triggers sometimes, like, oh, I'm frustrated because I had bad reps at practice, or I'm anxious because I screwed up last week and I don't want to let my team down this week. Or, hey, I'm feeling real good because I just came off a double-digit tackle game, couple interceptions, fumble recovery. I'm interested maybe the tools you implement with your non-athletes and maybe even your athletes that help them maybe identify some of these triggers that make them feel a certain way. I think it gets back to your point of thoughts control our emotions, which control our physiological response. How do you maybe teach people to declutter and identify their thoughts that are maybe dictating these emotions and these specifically negative emotions that can impact their performance?
Yeah. So the beauty of having a model or a theory of performance excellence in your own mind is like it helps you then think through situations. And so again, let's go back to my model starts with identity. And I think that's why it's really important. Like I love personality assessments. I know people have their perceptions on them. To me, it's a data point, right? And it helps you really get a clear picture of some of your tendencies. I think sometimes people can like lock themselves into, oh, I am X. And so that's not healthy. But one of the ones that I love to use is the Enneagram. And why I love the Enneagram is because I think it gets to really the core of who we are. It's one of the oldest assessments in the world. It comes out of like Eastern spirituality, actually. And how the theory goes is that at conception, we're all given a divine gift or power or virtue, basically, that then through our life experiences, that gift that we've been given manifests in either healthy or unhealthy ways. So it's classic nature and nurture. And some of the giftings, right, or powers are more dominant or are more passive or are wired a little bit more anxious, about certain things. And so that's why I think it's really helpful and healthy to have some of those data points because I'm wired a certain way. And if I were to coach people only on how I'm wired, like not everybody can be me and not everybody, they shouldn't be me, right? It's a lot. But we need to understand how are they going to come to a situation or scenario just based on how they're wired. And then I think that goes into mindset. What's your mindset when you mess up a play, right? What is your mindset? I let my team down. What is that anchored to? Where does that come from? Is that helpful? Right. Like I talked to one of our players this year. Right. And he just beat himself up after every bad play. And I said, who's your best friend on the team or in your position group? And he told me who it was. And I said, if he makes a mistake, what do you think about him? Do you think he's a terrible athlete and he shouldn't be on the field with this team? And he's like, well, no, of course not. I mean, he's awesome. He's here. Of course he's good. He's playing D1 football. And I was like, then why would you ever talk to yourself that way? And so we really try to flesh out what really goes into this mindset that you have. And is it right? Like right, quote unquote. Is it true? Can we test and apply it and understand if it's grounded in any sense of truth? And if not, then what's a healthier or more productive way that we can be thinking about this situation? And so And that when you can do that, that's leadership. That's learning to lead yourself in a very healthy and productive way that I think can guide us to the next best version of who we've been brought here to be. One of the simple tools, so that's sort of like macro level, I think, of how I would approach situations like that and think through them. But then, specifically, one of the tools that we use and that I use again with athletes and with business, all my clients, is the well, better, learned, right? It's, what went really well and why, right? And then what needs to go better and how, and then what did I learn about myself as an individual? What these things does is what went well and why. It allows us to understand what were some of the nuanced drivers that led to my success in this moment so that I can replicate them in the future, right? And then what needs to go better and how. That's like a diagnostic tool. The how is like the strategy behind how we're actually going to get better in this. And then what did I learn about myself as a man, as a woman, or as a team, right? That keeps fleshing out that identity piece that we want to get to. And what I've found with my clients is that simple tool, when they first start doing it, they're like, I played defense really well. Okay, good.
Really broad.
Really broad, right? Or I wasn't good in coverage. Okay, also really broad, right? And so the more people do this, then all of a sudden it's like, man, I didn't sit low enough in my back pedal. And so I wasn't able to get my hips opened up well enough or quick enough to get into my coverage right. Now all of a sudden, you hear the difference there. That first one, like I didn't do well in coverage. Basically, that creates like, man, maybe I'm not good enough to play coverage, right, on defense at this level or on this team or in this system, right? Whereas, man, I didn't get down on my hips low enough so I could get in my back pedal so I could get out of my back pedal. Like now all of a sudden, that's something specific that you can fix. And it's not about you necessarily. It's about this sort of technique that you've got to fix, and it allows you to actually fix it. And so that's why I love that framework. And because it allows us to strip the emotionality out of the highs and the lows, right? Because if you're playing well, you're like, man, I'm a stud. I got all this. I got it. Like you said, I got a sack, I got a tackle, got an interception, like whatever. Cool. Like what led you to get that? Because we need to be able to replicate those things. And then even though you balled out, what do you need to do better? Because we can always get better. And again, what I've found that do is just really strip the emotionality out of the highs and lows that go into performance in general and help people get a lot more strategic in how they are getting incrementally better day in and day out.
Mm. There's a common phrase used in investing, and I think a lot of people probably believe this in their life, and maybe that's why they get down on themselves, but it goes, the best indicator of future performance or behavior is past behavior or performance. And I think, I'll go back to my baseball days, right? Baseball is just a total game of failure, but the times I got in a slump were the times when maybe I struck out 2 or 3 times in a game and I wasn't able to move on from that, and it carried into the next game. So I was walking up to the plate thinking about, don't swing at the curveball in the dirt for strike 3. Like you've done that twice today. Don't do it again. And so I'm not in this state of flow or just of being in that moment and allowing, my practice and all the training I've done to take over. I'm interested in your thoughts on that saying. Do you believe that future performance and behavior is best determined by past behavior and performance? And if that's true, kind of how do you navigate that in your mind?
Yeah, I do a lot of interviews. So I'm a vice president for leadership and culture for Lippert, which is a global publicly traded manufacturing company. And then obviously a founder and consultant for Selking Performance Group and mental performance coach for the football team. But in my business world, like I do a lot of interviews there. And then with our athletes, we're always looking at like, are they going to make these poor mistakes again, right? If they're young guys. And so there's 2 things. Like when I'm interviewing people, I actually believe that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior for most people, right? Because I think most people are so grossly unaware of who they are and how they're showing up and the patterns that exist in their lives. And so they conform to those patterns, right? And those conforming patterns are therefore recurring. And so I think that is always where I start. with that basic assumption, or basic sort of belief, if you will. But I'm also a firm believer that people can change because of what we talked about as it relates to neuroplasticity. And so that's where the questioning then leads to try to sparse out, like, man, has this individual put in the work necessary to raise their level of awareness so that they can enhance who they are and how they show up, right? As you well know, building block one of the program is awareness, because you have to be aware before you enhance. And that's why it's building block one in our foundational mental performance training program. I don't know if I told you, Drew, but I wrote a book over COVID. It's coming out this fall. It's called Winning the Mental Game, the playbook for building championship mindsets. And it's that foundational program, right? It's the 8 mental X's and O's that go into running and winning your mental game. And the first play is awareness. You have to be aware before you enhance. And so I think that's the differentiator if we want our future behavior to be different than our past behavior. And I think that when teams and organizations and systems do a good job of like coaching and developing their people, then people aren't at the mercy of like mistakes they make their freshman year or their first couple years in business, because the leaders in the system gives them room to grow. And I think as human beings, that is so vitally, vitally important.
When will your book be available, and where can we find that?
So it's coming out in the fall. I don't have an exact release date yet. As soon as I do, I'll let you know, and would love to share that with your people. But it'll be on Amazon, it'll be on our website, and all of that. But I'll definitely keep you posted on that, because again, I think that. And I'm so adamant about these 8 building blocks and 8 mental plays, if you will, because I've worked a lot, with a lot of different people in a lot of different settings. And what I've found is that people will come to you and they'll be like, man, I have a confidence problem. Right. And so you work with them and it's like, man, you don't really have a confidence problem. You have an emotional control problem. And because you don't know how to manage your emotions, you're not able to show up in the moment confident. Right. Or I've got a focus problem. Man, you don't really have a focus problem. You have an awareness problem. And because you're not aware of the dynamics that are at play in this situation, you're not able to focus at the moment of execution. And so that's what led me to build this foundational program that, again, sequentially looks at some of the just foundational elements that go into mental performance and allow people to wire that in to how they function. And I think that when we do that, that's really when we can start to transform our minds, right? And be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And I think that's the power in sports psych and in general, but I think this program that we've put together several years ago.
It's cool that rule might be true, that our future performance is best indicated by our past, but it seems that we all have the ability to be an anomaly to that rule and to change the mental framework through which we operate, which is super cool.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% believe that. Like I said, I just think, unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people put enough time and effort into figuring out how to grow through that. And then I see a lot of systems that aren't conducive to letting people grow either. And that, reinforces, I think, the behavior patterns that you actually want to change in people. So it's and I think that's in my role. That's why I work so closely with Coach Kelly, right? And that's just a microcosm. But in general, when I work with teams or organizations, that's why I always want to work with the head leader, because that's the only person that can really influence the whole system and the structure. And that's when we get the system right. And then when we teach individuals within the system how to think, how to operate, how to function, how to become the best version of themselves, right? Flesh out their identity, grow their mindset, and increase their leadership ability of self, team, and their business, then all of a sudden, like, I think that's when greatness can happen, right? When the system is healthy and the people within the system are healthy. And quite frankly, we can do that because we know what leads to human high performance. And if you wire the systems in that lead to high performance, and I say high performance, but man, that can be in your home, that can be in your community, that can be in your sport team. That just means living in a way that we've been created and called to live.
Greatness is what we're striving for.
That's it. All day, every day.
Doc, thanks so much for coming on. It was a total treat and blessing to have you on, and we'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, it was an honor and a privilege, Drew. It's been so cool to watch your career, watch you grow as an athlete at Notre Dame, watch you grow as a professional athlete now, and a man and a father and a husband. It's exciting. And I'm excited to watch you continue to make a positive impact in this world. And like they teach us at Notre Dame, how to be a force for good.
Amen.